black man escorted off for praying. He got the airline banned in 3 countries. Have you ever witnessed a single moment so shocking that it snowballed into a worldwide movement? Meet Marcus Edwards, a soft-spoken yet determined man whose quiet prayer at 30,000 feet sparked a dramatic confrontation and led to the unthinkable, an entire airline getting banned from multiple countries. In a single instant, his faith and the prejudice of a flight crew collided in ways no one could have predicted. This story has intrigue, betrayal, triumph, and unbelievable twists that'll keep you glued to the end. Buckle up as we unravel the chain of events that began with a simple prayer and ended with global consequences. John F. Kennedy International Airport, situated in the bustling borough of Queens in New York, had always been a monument to Marcus Edwards's dreams. The hum of engines taking off and the roar of arrivals symbolized possibility. Marcus himself had stepped off planes here many times in the past, returning from visiting faraway places, sometimes for work, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes for reasons that felt more spiritual than rational. Never had he guessed, however, that this particular trip would change his life in ways he could not have imagined. Marcus was 32 years old, a recent graduate of a master's program in cultural anthropology. He was working for a non-profit organization focused on preserving endangered languages across the globe. Even though he lived in Harlem, he traveled constantly, bridging gaps between cultures, and he was a devout man, too, unapologetic about his faith. For Marcus, prayer was an integral part of his day. It wasn't simply a ritual. It was his lifeline. But on that sunny summer morning, as he headed toward Gate 23 in Terminal 4, Marcus was preoccupied, not with devotion, but with the excitement of flying to London for a conference. His flight was on Airline, a relatively small airline, known to budget-conscious travelers seeking transatlantic routes. Marcus had chosen it simply because the ticket price was reasonable and the flight times suited his schedule. He had done no real background check on them. He only remembered that Airline had begun ramping up international flights a few years earlier, trying to compete with bigger carriers. Their marketing emphasized convenience, direct routes, and low costs. What he didn't know was that Airline had a lesser-known reputation for cutting corners to keep overhead low. Some corners were minor, like not providing complimentary meals on long-haul flights, but other corners were more disturbing, such as a string of allegations regarding discriminatory treatment. But that was not on Marcus's mind. Instead, his thoughts flickered between the keynote address he was slated to give in London, the logistics of once again speaking about bridging cultural divides, and the moral imperative of preserving linguistic diversity. Pulling his suitcase behind him, wearing a simple grey hoodie jeans and sneakers, Marcus approached the check-in desk. He handed the clerk his passport and his ticket. The clerk greeted him politely, no sign of what was about to unfold. No reason to suspect that this particular flight would not only change Marcus's life, but rock an entire airline to its core. He had arrived at the airport early, breezed through security, and now had about an hour to kill before boarding. He spent the time rechecking his slides on a tablet, making sure he had everything ready for the conference. Then about 15 minutes before boarding began, he felt the urge to pray. Quietly, he found a small, unoccupied seating area near the gate and bowed his head silently, uttering a few lines of gratitude and seeking safe travel. He felt a sense of calm wash over him. Soon the boarding call came, and passengers lined up. Marcus had been assigned a seat in economy, 26A window seat. He found his row, stashed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and squeezed into his seat. The plane filled with families, Businessmen and tourists, flight attendants hurriedly assisted people finding seats. The overhead bins clicked shut. The door sealed with a hiss. Marcus offered a silent prayer again, something he did every time the cabin door closed, hoping for a smooth flight. Within moments, the plane taxied from the gate. Marcus thought it a bit odd that the entire pre-flight demonstration was done hastily. The flight attendants were curt and seemed tense. He simply assumed they were short-staffed or pressed for time. After all, airports could be stressful places, especially with an airline that had a packed schedule. As the airplane lifted from the runway, Marcus felt that delightful rush he always did. The sudden whoosh, the upward tilt, the ground falling away beneath him. Each flight felt like a minor miracle, humans defying gravity. But this particular flight would soon descend into a living nightmare, setting in motion consequences that no one in that cabin could have predicted. An hour into the flight meal service began, or rather, the limited service that Air Skyline offered in economy. They sold sandwiches and snacks for exorbitant prices. Marcus, being frugal, had packed his own peanut butter sandwich and an apple. He politely declined to purchase anything. He noticed some irritated chatter around him. People complaining that water wasn't free, that the seats were cramped, that the flight attendants were nowhere to be found. He didn't pay much attention. He had a conference to prepare for. He slipped off his shoes, placed them neatly beneath the seat in front of him, and took out his laptop. He began reading through his notes mentally, rehearsing his lines. 20 minutes passed, and a sudden turbulence shook the plane. The seatbelt sign pinged on the captain's voice. "Please be seated with seatbelts fastened." Marcus calmly closed his laptop, put it away, and obeyed. The turbulence got worse, jolting the cabin with enough force that a few overhead bins popped open. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, slamming them shut. Then just as quickly, the turbulence subsided. The sign went off. Marcus took a quiet moment to center himself, closed his eyes, and whispered a short prayer of thanks. This was when it all started to unravel. A flight attendant, Marcus would later recall her name, as Julie was walking the aisle, checking on passengers, post-turbulence. She noticed Marcus's lips moving silently. At first, he thought nothing of it. He had prayed countless times on airplanes without incident. But this time, he caught a brief flicker of some emotion on Julie's face. Confusion. Maybe alarm. Marcus, unaware of the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, resumed reading. Moments later, he heard hushed whispers behind him. Someone said, "I saw him chanting something earlier." Another voice muttered, "Makes me nervous." Heart pounding, he realized they were talking about him. He glanced over his shoulder. Two passengers, an older couple, quickly looked away. Marcus sighed and turned forward again, deciding it best to ignore them. But the tension wouldn't let up. A few minutes later, Julie returned with a stern expression, glancing at Marcus's seat. She lingered near row 26, as if deciding whether to say something or not. Eventually she pivoted away. Heading to the galley, Marcus told himself he might be reading too much into it, but his instincts told him something was off. The seatbelt sign turned on again as the pilot announced more turbulence ahead. Marcus, wanting to calm himself, clasped his hands in silent reflection. His posture was subtle. He wasn't reciting anything aloud, but the older couple behind him apparently noticed. Their words were louder this time, audible over the roar of the plane's engines. "He's doing it again. Something about him is suspicious. Do you think he's—" Marcus's stomach knotted. He'd been in enough situations where people's ignorance about his faith or their latent racism bubbled up. He took a deep breath. Maybe it was just fear. He told himself many travelers were anxious about mid-flight turbulence. but something about this moment felt more ominous. He glimpsed around. Some other passengers had started to notice the tension, peering at him, then glancing away. He considered politely introducing himself to the couple behind him, perhaps to ease their worries, but before he could, a flight attendant's voice announced the flight crew was suspending in-cabin service due to continuing turbulence. Marcus decided this wasn't the right time. Instead, he closed his eyes and silently prayed for peace, for protection, for the plane to pass through the turbulence unscathed. Little did he know these moments of prayer would soon be weaponized against him. The turbulence finally died down about 30 minutes later. Outside, the sun had disappeared behind thick clouds. The cabin lights glowed dimly. Passengers settled back into their routines. Some watched movies, others dozed off. Marcus retrieved his phone to listen to some music, mindful that it had to remain on airplane mode. Suddenly, a different flight attendant, her name tag read. Carol appeared in the aisle next to him. She wore a strained smile. Leaning in, she said quietly, "Sir, can I speak with you for a moment in the galley?" Marcus blinked, feeling a swirl of anxiety. Of course, he stood up, noticing as he did so that the older couple behind him stared daggers at his back. Their expressions were pinched with suspicion or maybe fear. He followed Carol to the small galley at the rear of the plane. The space was cramped, the hum of the engines loud. Carol's posture radiated tension. Another flight attendant, Julie, hovered in the corner. Arms crossed, Carol spoke first. "We've received a complaint from a few passengers that you were saying something in a foreign language. They said you were chanting, and it was making them uncomfortable." Marcus's heart pounded. He forced himself to remain calm. "I'm praying silently." "It's part of my faith. I haven't been saying anything out loud." Carol exchanged a glance with Julie. Julie cleared her throat. "We're going to have to ask you to refrain from conducting any activities that might alarm other passengers." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Ma'am, I'm simply praying. I'm not harming anyone. I'm not chanting anything out loud. I was whispering quietly to myself at most." "Is that a violation of any airline policy?" Carol tried to keep her voice even. "We have no formal policy against praying, but we do have a responsibility to maintain a safe and calm environment. If some passengers interpret your behavior as threatening, that's their misunderstanding." Marcus interjected, trying to keep his tone respectful, but firm. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm a paying passenger on this airline just like them." Julie took a step forward. "Look, sir, I'm just going to be honest. You're making a few people very uncomfortable. We're asking you for the sake of maintaining order to keep your prayers entirely to yourself. No audible whispering. No gestures that could be misconstrued." His chest tightened. "So because someone else is uncomfortable with my silent prayer, I must stop. Isn't that discrimination?" Carol and Julie exchanged another look. Carol pressed her lips together. "If you don't comply, we may have to consider removing you from the flight or diverting." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Removing me for silently praying? Are you serious?" A loaded silence followed. Then Julie muttered, "Just watch it." "Okay." She turned and left. Carol gave an apologetic shrug and followed. Marcus stood there, stunned, pinned in place by the absolute absurdity of the situation. He eventually returned to his seat, ignoring the stares. Keeping his eyes on the back of the seat in front of him, he swallowed his anger. He managed to calm himself enough to put on some music and zone out. The flight had about 4 hours left. He decided to focus on his notes and do his best to avoid further confrontation, but the universe had other plans. An hour later, The seatbelt sign came on again for more turbulence. Marcus closed his eyes and silently prayed. This time, he made sure not to move his lips at all. Yet the older couple behind him must have been watching. They whispered furiously. "He's doing it again." "He's definitely praying. Who knows what he's planning?" Carol appeared in the aisle again. She gestured for Marcus to remain seated, kneeling next to his seat. She said through clenched teeth, "Sir, I thought we were clear." Marcus's frustration soared. In a low whisper, he replied, "I'm not chanting. I'm not even moving my lips. I'm just sitting here." My eyes closed. "That's it." Behind them, the older couple piped up. The husband's voice trembled. "We feel threatened. We don't know what he's planning." The wife clutched her purse and said, "We've seen things on the news." Marcus whipped around to face them, voice tight. "I'm just a man of faith. I have no ill intentions." "Please understand that." He was cut off by the older man's sharp retort. "You could be some radical for all we know. You were whispering foreign words." Carol tried to insert herself between them. "All right, let's all calm down." But the tension in that section of the cabin was palpable. Other passengers were craning their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the argument. Some looked at Marcus with curiosity or worry. Others simply frowned at the older couple's outburst. Marcus felt a swell of righteous anger, but he told himself to remain measured. "Mom," he said to Carol, "I'm doing nothing illegal or disruptive. I'm just sitting in my seat. If these passengers choose to interpret my prayers as a threat, that's on them. I can't do anything more to reassure them." By now, Julie had arrived. She leaned down to Carol and whispered something. Carol nodded and looked at Marcus. "I'm going to need to see your ID again." Marcus blinked, confused. "Why, we need to verify a few things," Carol said stiffly. "It's protocol when there's a disturbance." Marcus was stunned, but he retrieved his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Carol took it, scribbled something on a notepad, and handed it back. He felt humiliated, singled out. The older couple seemed smug, as if they had scored some victory. The plane continued on through the night. Marcus stewed silently. He wanted to record what was happening, but he didn't want to provoke the crew. He told himself he'd just hold it together until they landed in London. He could file a complaint, maybe talk to a lawyer. Anything to get through this flight safely. But fate dealt another blow. 2 hours before landing, the pilot made an announcement that bad weather in London was forcing a diversion to Shannon Airport in Ireland. A groan passed through the cabin. The flight was now extended. Instead of a direct route to London's Heathrow, they'd land in Shannon, refuel, and wait out the storm. Marcus sighed, wishing the ordeal would just end. During the descent into Shannon, the older couple continued to whisper anxiously. The flight attendants shot repeated warning glances at Marcus. He closed his eyes again, trying to find solace in silent reflection, bracing himself for a rough landing. The plane touched down at Shannon with a jolt and taxied to a remote stand. The passengers were told they'd remain on board for refueling and await for the weather to clear over London. That's when the real trouble began. Flight attendants began walking up and down the aisles. One of them picked up the intercom. "Passengers, we'll be on the ground here for about 90 minutes. Please remain seated as the fuel truck connects. Once refueling is complete, you'll be free to move about the cabin or use the restrooms, but do not leave the aircraft." "We appreciate your patience." Marcus tried to turn his phone on to check if they had data service on the ground. Airplane mode off. A few bars popped up. He quickly typed a message to a friend in London, letting him know about the diversion. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw Carol and Julie returning, accompanied by a man in a suit. The man's name tag identified him as the head purser. They all wore grim expressions. Marcus straightened in his seat. His breath caught in his throat. The head purser cleared his throat, Sir Edwards. "We've spoken with the captain. Due to multiple passenger complaints, we are removing you from this flight." A wave of cold shock washed over him. "What, I haven't done anything wrong," Julie frowned. "Your behavior has created a disturbance among passengers. We cannot continue this flight with you on board." Marcus's voice cracked as he struggled to contain his anger and disbelief. "Because I prayed," Carol quickly added. "We've asked you multiple times to refrain from suspicious behavior." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Suspicious behavior? I'm just a black man praying quietly on a plane. That's suspicious to you?" At this, the older couple behind him piped up again. He was chanting. We heard him chanting in some foreign language. Marcus almost lost it. I was praying in English, my mother tongue, and it was barely a whisper. The head purser held up a hand. "Sir, this decision has been made. We'll have local authorities escort you off." Marcus felt his heart pound, rage and humiliation swirling in his stomach. "Escort me off." "Are you serious?" Within moments, 2 uniformed airport security officers boarded the plane. Passengers watched with wide eyes. Some took out their phones, capturing video. Marcus noticed that, ironically, these sudden camera-wielding bystanders were the same folks who had probably ignored the tension before. Now they had their drama to film. The security officers approached Marcus. One of them spoke gently. "Sir, please come with us. We need to de-escalate the situation." Marcus had no choice. If he resisted, the situation could worsen. He stood, grabbed his carry-on bag, and cast one last glance at the older couple, who looked both vindicated and uneasy under the gaze of other passengers. As he walked up the aisle, several other passengers started yelling at the crew. "This is not right." He didn't do anything. He was just praying. Meanwhile, a few others muttered, "Good riddance," or "finally." Marcus forced himself to keep his head high, but his pride was in tatters. The entire cabin had become a stage for his humiliation. When he reached the front of the plane, the head purser said, curtly, "Your checked luggage will be offloaded. You can follow the security officers into the terminal." And then Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge, escorted by uniformed guards on an unscheduled stop in Ireland, forcibly removed from a flight for the crime of praying. Little did Skyline know this single unjust action would trigger a chain reaction that would shake the airline to its core. Inside Shannon Airport's terminal, the security officers led Marcus down a sterile-looking hallway that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. They paused at a grey door with a frosted glass window, ushering him into a small interview room. The room had little more than a table, 2 plastic chairs, and the low hum of fluorescent lighting. One officer introduced himself as Officer McDonough, the other Officer Kelleher. Their manner was calm but cautious, as if they couldn't decide whether Marcus posed a threat or was simply the victim he claimed to be. Sir McDonough began his Irish accent, soft but firm. "We'll just take a few minutes to get your statement. You're not being detained, you're not under arrest. This is just procedure. The airline requested your removal, so we need to record what happened in your own words." Marcus's heart still pounded from the humiliation he had just endured. He took a seat, trying to steady his hands. I don't understand why I was removed," he said, voice cracking. "I was praying silently to myself, and a few passengers decided that made me dangerous." Apparently, Kelleher pulled out a small notebook and clicked a pen. "Did you threaten anyone, sir?" "Absolutely not," Marcus replied. "There are witnesses on that plane who can back me up. I was polite. I complied with all instructions. When they asked me to go to the galley, I did. When they said stop praying audibly, I did. But apparently even closing my eyes set people off. MacDonald and Kelleher shared a quick look. On their faces was the resigned expression of men who had seen all manner of travel disruptions, from drunken brawls to smuggling attempts. But this was different, a scenario fueled by paranoia and bigotry rather than actual criminal activity. "We'll note that down," said MacDonald, jotting quickly in his own notebook. He then explained that under aviation regulations, the captain and flight crew do have broad authority to remove passengers who are deemed disruptive. He shrugged as if to say, "It's out of our hands. But from what we can see, you haven't broken any Irish laws. Once we finish taking your statement, you'll be free to go." Marcus felt his stomach twist. "So that's it?" he asked, trying to keep the anger from spilling out. "The airline says I'm disruptive, and you have to enforce it, no matter how unjust," Kelleher sighed. "We have no choice. The captain has the final say. On board. If they want you off, we have to comply for the flight's sake. I'm sorry." It was obvious they both sympathized with him, but their hands were tied. After 10 more minutes of back and forth verifying Marcus's identity and flight details, the officers shut their notebooks. Kelleher gave Marcus a half-smile of apology. "You can gather your belongings at baggage services. We'll have someone escort you there. After that, you're free to go about your business. You won't be charged or held." Marcus sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Thank you," he murmured, although gratitude was the last thing he felt. Once the door to the interview room opened, MacDonald led Marcus back through the hallway, passing by windows that revealed the tarmac, where Air Skyline Flight 274 still sat a fuel truck connected to its belly, even though the plane was right there. Marcus understood he would never be allowed to reboard. He noticed ground staff swirling around the aircraft, stowing cargo, checking fuel lines and preparing for departure. It was surreal. Only 30 minutes ago, he had been one of the passengers preparing to continue on to London. They emerged into a quieter corridor of the main concourse, passing a row of shuttered duty-free shops. Marcus saw a handful of early shift airport workers sipping coffee or yawning behind their counters. It was nearing midnight local time, and the terminal felt desolate. A clock on the wall ticked away each second of his sudden exile. MacDonald stopped at a set of automatic doors. "Your bag will arrive on a special belt near Lost and Found," he said. "If there's any problem retrieving it, ask for me at the security desk." Marcus forced a tight-lipped nod. "Thanks for your help," he said. Though his voice sounded steady, anger and humiliation still churned inside him. He pushed through the doors into the main arrivals hall, blinking at the bright overhead lights. Within moments, Marcus spotted a solitary luggage carousel in motion, spitting out a handful of bags. A single airport attendant in a reflective vest stood by, fiddling with a phone. Marcus approached, and the attendant asked for his name. She checked a clipboard and nodded. Moments later, a nondescript black suitcase tumbled onto the belt, the same one Marcus had checked in back at JFK. He hoisted it off, noting how oddly final it felt. "This is all that's left of my journey, my luggage, and me stranded." He drifted to a nearby bench, slumping down as the enormity of it all sank in. He checked his phone, which was bursting with missed calls from family and a friend in London who'd been expecting him. Text messages ranged from, "Where are you?" to, "Is everything okay?" summoning his will. He tapped out quick responses, summarizing that he had been thrown off the plane, was stuck in Shannon, and would try to catch another flight in the morning. Anger bubbled up this time, fueling a steely determination. They can't get away with this. Marcus had experienced subtle racism before, but never had he been so publicly singled out and humiliated. He opened his phone's camera and switched to video mode. His reflection stared back, a weary, upset man in rumpled clothes. Yet he pressed record. "I'm sitting here in Shannon Airport, Ireland." He began, voice subdued but resolute, because Air Skyline kicked me off for praying. Yes, praying. He recounted each key moment, from the older couple's paranoia to the flight attendant's accusations to the final escort off the plane. Tears welled, but he let them fall. I can't believe this is 2025, and I'm telling this story. But I won't be silent. People need to know. He ended the recording and saved it, deciding to upload it later once he could think clearly. Maybe he told himself he'd only share it with family or a few close friends. He didn't yet realize the impact such a video would have. Exhaustion seeped into his bones. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation ebbed away, leaving him hollow. He trudged toward a small cafe, still open, purchased a bottle of water and a stale sandwich, and settled back on the bench to contemplate his next step. The tinted windows beyond showed the blackness of an Irish night. He felt marooned physically and emotionally. In the dim overhead lighting, he pulled out his phone again to search for last-minute flights to London. Every click reminded him how none of this should have happened. An eye-watering sum later, he managed to book a seat on a different airline, departing early the next morning. He'd arrive in London just hours before his conference session. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best shot at salvaging the trip. A strange thought crossed his mind. Should I complain to Air Skyline's customer service? But the notion felt both laughable and infuriating. They had orchestrated this entire ordeal. Complaining seemed futile. Still, he considered lodging a formal grievance once he was stateside. Maybe he'd write an email demanding answers, or maybe in time a lawsuit would be in order. The idea hovered unformed, yet insistent. He tried to sleep, but the hard bench was unforgiving, and his mind wouldn't shut down. Each time he closed his eyes, he imagined the disapproving stares of the flight attendants, the shrill accusations of the older couple, the whispered slurs and sideways glances. A swirl of emotions raged beneath his fatigue: anger, sadness, embarrassment, and a burning desire for justice. Around 3 a.m., Marcus gave up on sleep. He rose, wandered through the near-empty terminal, passing closed shops and dimmed gate areas. Eventually, he found a vending machine and bought a cheap travel pillow. He tried to rest again, but an hour later, the terminal lights snapped brighter as cleaning staff arrived. Sighing, he rose to his feet, walked to the nearest restroom, and splashed cold water on his face, staring at himself in the mirror. He mumbled a quiet prayer, still shaken by how that very act had caused such havoc only hours before. But here, beneath the fluorescent glow, he reminded himself that his faith was his own, a source of inner strength that no airline or fearful passenger could take away. Finally, at 5:30 a.m., announcements for early flights echoed across the concourse. Marcus made his way to the check-in counter for his hastily purchased ticket. The agent, an older Irish woman with a kind smile, noticed the tension in his face and asked long night love. He almost broke down at the simple compassion in her voice. Instead, he nodded and offered a faint smile. "You could say that." She checked him in without fuss, handed over a boarding pass, and wished him a pleasant journey. The ease of that transaction felt jarringly different from his recent ordeal. Clutching the boarding pass, Marcus murmured a silent vow. "I won't let Air Skyline or anyone keep doing this to people." He recalled how powerless he had felt on the plane, how easily a few paranoid whispers had stolen his dignity. If sharing his story could stop another person from going through the same abuse. Then he had to speak up. At the gate, he slumped into a seat and opened his phone again, rewatching the raw video he'd recorded. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable. He was still deciding whether to share it publicly. Deep down, though, he sensed that what had happened on that flight went beyond his personal experience. It represented something bigger, a glaring example of prejudice that thrived when left unchallenged. When the boarding call finally came, Marcus stood and joined the line. He felt a wave of relief. In just over an hour, he'd land in London and do what he originally set out to do: speak at a conference about cultural anthropology and bridging divides. But now he had a new burden on his heart and mind. The short flight to London was uneventful. No suspicious glances. No confrontation. Nothing. It was exactly how air travel should be. As the plane soared above the Irish Sea, Marcus gazed at the clouds, the rising sun painting them gold. A quiet determination settled over him. I can't let Air Skyline get away with this. When the wheels touched down at Heathrow, he felt a strange mixture of relief and simmering rage. He gathered his bag, left the plane, and navigated the arrivals process. Everything felt routine, like any other trip he'd taken in the past. Yet inside, he knew his life had irrevocably changed. Would he just file a complaint? Speak to a lawyer? Go on social media? He wasn't sure yet, but he knew he couldn't bury this. The memory of that older couple's hateful, fearful words and the flight attendant's cold compliance replayed in his head like a broken record. No, he thought as he spotted his friend waiting for him at the arrivals hall. They don't get to sweep this under the rug. He hurried forward, prepared to recount the nightmare. Little did he realize how quickly his personal account would explode across social media rally support worldwide and spark a chain of events that would ultimately bring a mighty airline to its knees. Marcus arrived in London, physically depleted, but emotionally charged. After checking into his hotel, he cleaned up, changed clothes, and headed straight to the conference venue. Despite the ordeal, he managed to deliver his keynote speech that afternoon. His voice was strong, and his words about cultural understanding and empathy struck a new chord. Inside, though, he was reeling. He kept reliving the flight's events. After the talk, he opened up to some colleagues about what happened. Shocked and outraged, they encouraged him to go public. "Don't let them get away with it," said Dr. Catherine Norn, a linguist he deeply respected, another colleague. Ahmed told him I was profiled once at an airport. It's terrifying how easily people stereotype us. You have a platform, use it. That evening, back in his hotel room, Marcus posted a concise version of his video on social media. He titled it, "Kicked Off Flight for Praying My Story, Air Skyline." In the caption, he summarized what happened, specifying the flight number, the date, and the location. He maintained a calm, factual tone, but he didn't hold back the emotional truth of how it felt. Then he turned off his phone notifications, not expecting much immediate response. He woke up the next morning to find his post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, comments, retweets, people expressing outrage, sympathy, disbelief. He saw supportive messages from various faith communities, civil rights organizations, and countless individuals who identified with his plight. He also saw hate messages, people calling him a liar, accusing him of seeking attention, or saying hateful things about his race and religion. But overshadowing the hate, he noticed a groundswell of solidarity. News outlets reached out, wanting interviews. Hashtags like "You're praying while black" and "Your Air Skyline discrimination" began to trend. Marcus felt both overwhelmed and vindicated. Something big was happening. Over the next few days, major news sites started running stories. Passenger removed from flight for praying sparks controversy. They interviewed airline representatives, who gave the typical canned responses. We prioritize the safety and comfort of all passengers. Certain behaviors caused alarm. We regret any inconvenience. But those statements only fueled the public's outrage. People demanded accountability. Then an unexpected twist: other passengers from that same flight posted their own videos. Some had captured the confrontation with phone cameras. A few even recorded the older couple's paranoid ranting. One passenger's clip clearly showed Marcus speaking calmly to flight attendants, while the older man behind him angrily said, "We've seen people like you on the news. The visual evidence was damning." Suddenly, this wasn't just Marcus's word against Air. Skyline's. It was a swarm of eyewitness accounts and video proof of bigotry. The condemnation of Air Skyline spread online like wildfire. Calls for boycotts grew. Civil rights lawyers began sniffing around. The airline's PR department scrambled, releasing vague statements about disruptive behavior. But the more they insisted Marcus was disruptive, the more contradictory the passenger videos looked. The public backlash only increased. And that was just the beginning. Marcus flew back to New York a week later. He was mentally exhausted from interviews, social media storms, and heated discussions about bigotry in air travel. But a new door opened when a high-profile civil rights attorney, Jasmine Rowe, contacted him. She specialized in discrimination lawsuits and smelled a landmark case. "Marcus, if you're up for it, we can sue Air Skyline for discrimination, breach of contract, and emotional distress," she said during their first meeting in a Manhattan law office. "We have strong evidence thanks to those passenger videos. We could pursue a substantial claim and, more importantly, push for systemic changes in the airline's policies." Marcus hesitated, concerned about the stress a lawsuit could bring. But the injustice he'd suffered, and the messages from thousands of people who felt similarly targeted, pushed him forward. "Let's do it," he said, voice wavering with determination. Jasmine got to work filing the suit in federal court. Within days, news channels plastered the headlines, "Air Skyline facing major discrimination. Our lawsuit, the airline's stock prices dipped." Its PR apparatus went into overdrive, releasing statements about how they value diversity and welcome passengers of all backgrounds. But the public wasn't buying it. Then an unexpected ally emerged, an ex-employee of Air Skyline named Leonard Reed. He reached out to Jasmine's office, claiming he had internal documents detailing a pattern of discriminatory incidents. According to Leonard, the airline had a practice of overcaution whenever certain passengers, particularly those of color or wearing religious garments, were deemed to make other passengers uncomfortable. In a secret memo that Leonard had copied, the airline's management advised flight attendants to take no chances and remove potentially disruptive passengers preemptively, rather than risk bad press should a real incident occur. Jasmine was stunned, and so was Marcus when he saw the documents. "They literally encourage racial profiling," Jasmine said, scanning the pages. "This is huge. If we can authenticate these documents in court, Air Skyline is done." But there was more. Leonard claimed that such policies had quietly led to multiple unreported incidents in the past year. Passengers of South Asian, Middle Eastern, and African descent forcibly removed for suspected threats that turned out to be harmless. Most of these passengers had simply wanted to avoid hassle, so they accepted vouchers or hush settlements from the airline. Marcus felt his anger reignite. "This can't keep happening," he told Jasmine. "We have to go all in." Word of the lawsuit spread beyond the US. Soon human rights organizations in Europe and Africa took notice. They demanded governments scrutinize Air Skyline's practices. Petitions circulated, calling for banning the airline until it reformed its policies. Marcus's story became a catalyst, exposing a deep-rooted prejudice in the company's operational culture. Air Skyline tried to fight back. They hired expensive lawyers. They claimed the older couple's fear was sincere, and that flight attendants were simply following safety protocols. But internal memos suggested otherwise, that the airline actively chose to remove certain passengers if any complaint was raised. They rarely investigated the validity of those complaints or attempted to de-escalate first. Then, in a stunning move, the governments of Nigeria, South Africa and Kenya took notice, particularly after local newspapers ran front-page articles about the racist nature of Air Skyline's policies. Air Skyline had been trying to expand its route network in Africa, hoping to tap into growing markets. Public uproar in those countries surged. Diplomatic conversations turned heated, especially as diaspora communities demanded immediate action. Within a month, Nigeria announced it would rescind Air Skyline's landing rights until further notice. South Africa followed suit, citing violations of anti-discrimination principles. Kenya joined them next, effectively banning the airline from operating flights to or from their major airports. The headlines were explosive. Air Skyline banned from 3 African nations over discrimination allegations. A sense of triumph welled up in Marcus when he read the news, but he also felt an undercurrent of sorrow. It was painful to realize that an airline could be so blindly prejudiced that entire countries felt compelled to shut it out. Now Air Skyline found itself in crisis mode. Routes to Africa were lucrative, or at least they had been. Losing 3 major countries meant losing a sizable chunk of future revenue. Worse, the blow to their reputation was massive. Their CEO tried damage control, issuing statements of deep regret. They offered new diversity, training for staff, an external review of their removal policies and donations to civil rights charities. But the public was unconvinced. Their past statements had rung hollow, and the newly revealed internal memos confirmed that the discrimination wasn't a fluke. It was institutional. Marcus watched all this unfold from home. He was torn between a sense of vindication and the exhaustion of being at the center of a media firestorm. Journalists camped outside his apartment building, hoping for interviews. Late-night talk shows satirized Air Skyline's plight. Comedic hosts mocking the airline's ham-fisted attempts at PR. A wave of boycott campaigns hammered them online. Travel bloggers recommended alternative airlines, citing the risk of unjust removals. Meanwhile, Marcus's lawsuit continued to gain momentum. With the help of Leonard's internal documents, Jasmine pushed for punitive damages. "We're going to teach them a lesson they'll never forget," she said in a press conference on the courthouse steps. Marcus, standing beside her, felt a swirl of emotions. He appreciated the widespread support, but also felt the immense weight of being the face of a global conversation on racism in the skies. Behind the scenes, the older couple who had initiated the complaint on that flight seemed to vanish from public view. Some reporters tried to track them down for comment. Rumors surfaced that they'd been bribed by the airline's legal team to keep quiet. No one could confirm it. Marcus's only consolation was that their unreasoning fear and prejudice had sparked a broader reckoning. In a cruel twist, their small-mindedness forced the world to face a larger injustice. Over the next few months, the lawsuit wore on. Air Skyline's lawyers attempted to settle out of court multiple times, offering large sums of money if Marcus would drop the case. Each time Marcus and Jasmine discussed it, but each time they refused. "This isn't just about money," he said firmly. "We want a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, policy changes, and a real apology." Air Skyline balked at that last demand, knowing it could open them up to a flood of other lawsuits. but no one could stop the juggernaut of negative publicity that battered the airline competitors swooped in to fill the void, especially on African routes, while Air Skyline flights flew half-empty as customers boycotted. The airline's stocks continued to plummet. Corporate leadership grew desperate, reshuffling executive positions and firing middle managers. Nothing seemed to restore the public's trust. And all this time, Marcus tried to keep living his life. He traveled for his non-profit, work gave more talks on cultural empathy, and was invited to speak on panels about discrimination. It wasn't the life he had envisioned. He never asked to be a civil rights figure. Yet here he was, forging a path he believed in. He prayed for guidance every day, carrying himself with the calm dignity he had shown on that fateful flight. A year after the infamous flight, the civil trial against Air Skyline finally began in a federal court in New York. The courtroom was packed, journalists, activists, and curious onlookers all cramming in. The presiding judge was known for fairness, but also for impatience with corporate obfuscation. On the first day, Jasmine made her opening statement, painting a vivid picture of Marcus's ordeal and the airline's discriminatory policies. This case, she said, is about an airline that systematically targeted a passenger based on prejudice and an invented fear, leading not only to his unlawful removal, but to a wave of public outcry that exposed a rotten corporate culture. Air Skyline's lawyers responded with a coolly delivered defense, claiming safety concerns and the legitimate anxiety of other passengers, insisting that Marcus's removal was an unfortunate but necessary measure. They tried to paint him as combative, referencing how he confronted the older couple. But passenger videos discredited that spin, showing Marcus calm, polite, and the couple hysterical. Over the next few weeks, witness after witness took the stand. Former employees, passengers from that flight, even an expert on airline policies, Leonard Reed, testified about the internal memos verifying their authenticity. The airline's attorneys tried to undermine him as a disgruntled ex-employee. He stood firm, stating he left because he couldn't stomach the discrimination. The turning point came when the flight attendants, Carol and Julie, took the stand. Corporate lawyers had prepped them extensively. But in cross-examination, Jasmine systematically dismantled their excuses. She played snippets of passenger videos, forcing them to confront the discrepancy between their statements and the actual footage. They squirmed on the stand, stammering about company guidelines and following orders. Finally, the older couple, Peter and Edith Marsh, were subpoenaed to testify. Their appearance caused a media frenzy. They seemed terrified and reluctant. Under oath, Peter Marsh admitted he had felt scared seeing Marcus pray. Jasmine asked why. I just didn't know what he was saying. He replied, "We see things on TV, people chanting before bowed things happen on planes." Jasmine's voice dripped with quiet condemnation. "So your fear was based on stereotypes you've seen on television. Correct? Did Mr. Edwards do or say anything threatening toward you directly?" Peter Marsh swallowed. "No," he admitted, voice small. In her closing argument, Jasmine stressed that this was the root of the matter. Ignorance and fear leading to discriminatory action, all facilitated by an airline policy that put prejudice above the rights of a peaceful passenger. After 3 days of jury deliberation, the verdict came in. The jury found Air Skyline guilty of discrimination and wrongful removal. They awarded Marcus both compensatory and punitive damages, totaling an 8-figure sum. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The presiding judge stated that the airline's behavior was egregious and reflected a systemic disregard for basic civil liberties. The news spread instantly. Air Skyline loses landmark discrimination. case ordered to pay millions. The airline's CEO tried to project calm in a press conference, announcing they would appeal. But the victory for Marcus was a tidal wave, galvanizing calls for even stricter oversight of discriminatory practices in air travel. Civil rights leaders hailed it as a major step forward. Social media celebrated with memes praising Marcus for standing up to injustice. Within weeks, more passengers came forward with their own stories of discrimination by Air Skyline, emboldened by the court's ruling. Class action suits loomed, meanwhile. The ban on Air Skyline remained in place in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. Other countries hinted they might follow suit. With its brand in tatters, the airline's share price collapsed further. Board members faced pressure to sell. Eventually, a larger competitor acquired Air. Skyline's assets rebranded the planes and quietly phased out the once prominent name. Employees were either absorbed into the new structure or laid off. The airline, known as Air Skyline, ceased to exist. Marcus felt a whirlwind of emotions: relief, vindication, sorrow for those employees caught in the crossfire. Yet he recognized that the downfall of Air Skyline wasn't just about him. It was a testament to how one act of injustice, once exposed, could ignite a global backlash if it touched a collective nerve. A single spark could become a raging fire, forcing entrenched institutions to reckon with their prejudices. Even after the lawsuits and the bans, karma wasn't done with those who perpetuated the injustice. Carol and Julie, the flight attendants, found themselves blacklisted in aviation circles. They attempted to gain employment with other airlines, but background checks revealed they had been central figures in a discrimination scandal. Both ended up leaving the industry entirely. Reports suggested Carol faced a severe financial crisis, while Julie moved away to an undisclosed location to avoid media harassment. Their part in the fiasco had come back to haunt them. Peter and Edith Marsh also suffered. The viral videos of their paranoid accusations made them infamous on social media. Their faces became memes for bigotry. Neighbors recognized them, and local communities ostracized them. The Marshes tried to claim they had been manipulated by the airline, but few believed it. They had exposed their own ignorance for the world to see, and the world didn't easily forget. As for Air, Skyline's top executives, several were forced to resign in disgrace. Investigations revealed questionable financial practices and hush money payments to victims of discrimination. A few even faced criminal charges for fraud or misuse of company funds. Lawsuits drained their personal fortunes. Their names became synonymous with corporate malfeasance. The very system that had profited from turning a blind eye to discrimination collapsed under the weight of ethical scrutiny. And so, in a swirl of poetic justice, the same prejudice that had targeted Marcus ultimately sank the entire enterprise. The scale of their wrongdoing was laid bare. The airline didn't merely lose money, it lost legitimacy, trust, and the right to continue operating in certain global markets. Karma, as it were, had arrived full circle. Marcus Edwards emerged from the ordeal, changed forever. He used part of the court-awarded money to support educational programs in marginalized communities. He continued working with his non-profit, expanding its reach. Invitations poured in for him to speak about cultural empathy, faith, and human rights. He never let the experience embitter him. Instead, he transformed the pain into purpose. Where possible, he tried to maintain a compassionate stance, even towards those who wronged him, though he refused to condone or excuse their actions. In public speeches, he emphasized that ignorance can be cured by understanding, but willful hate must be challenged head-on. His story became a flashpoint for change in the airline industry. Under pressure from new regulations and an awakened public, most major carriers revised their training programs to ensure staff could distinguish genuine security concerns from cultural or religious expression. The concept of praying while black as a threat was widely denounced. Many airlines publicly vowed to do better. In the end, Marcus's quiet prayer had resonated globally. His case remained a testament to how a single act of discrimination, caught on camera and magnified by social media, could dismantle institutionalized prejudice. One flight changed my life. Marcus often said, a half smile on his face. But maybe it also helped change the world. He'd remember that day on Air Skyline for the rest of his life, being singled out, removed, and humiliated. Yet he also remembered it as the first domino in a chain that led to a global conversation, an airline's downfall, and a renewed push for justice. And he never stopped praying each day, thankful for the strange, sometimes tumultuous journey that had turned him into an unexpected catalyst for change. And that, my friends, is the unbelievable saga of how a single act of quiet prayer at 30,000 feet sparked a chain of events that toppled an airline and redefined standards for human dignity. In the skies, Marcus Edwards's story reminds us that standing up for our rights, even when it feels risky and daunting, can reshape the world. It exposes how ignorance and fear can corrupt entire systems, and how shining a light on injustice can bring about long overdue change. If you found this story riveting, if it moved you, inspired you, or even made you rethink how we treat one another, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to this channel. By spreading the word, we not only honor Marcus's courage, but also encourage everyone to keep fighting for justice. Thank you for watching, and remember, one voice can make a world of difference.